In the 1800s, Britain exhibited tall men at circuses. They weren't freaks, they were the last ones. Picture a cold night in Edinburgh in the winter of 1800. The streets are lit by oil lamps, the cobblestones are slick with recent rain, and somewhere near the Canongate, a crowd of perhaps 50 people is pushing through a narrow doorway into a room that smells of tallow candles and wet wool. They have paid their admission at the door. They have been told what to expect by the handbill, pressed into their hands outside, which promises them something that the handbill describes as one of the most astonishing productions of nature ever exhibited to an admiring public. They are ordinary people, tradesmen and their wives, a few students from the university, a physician who has come on professional rather than personal curiosity, a pair of young aristocrats who have come because there is nothing more interesting happening elsewhere in the city tonight. They file into the room, they arrange themselves along the walls, and they wait. And then, through a door at the far end of the room, a man enters. He has to turn sideways to get his shoulders through the frame. He has to duck to get his head under the lintel. And when he straightens up and stands at his full height in the middle of the room, the ceiling is close enough above him that he could reach up and touch it without fully extending his arm. He is somewhere between 7 feet 8 and 7 feet 11 inches tall. He is 23 years old. His name is not recorded in any surviving account of this particular exhibition. He is listed in the handbill only as the Caledonian Colossus, which is what his manager called him, and the manager's name is also not recorded, and the physician's notes from the evening survive only in a fragment that describes the measurements and nothing else. And so this man, this 23-year-old, who stood in a cold Edinburgh room while strangers pressed against the walls and stared at him, exists in history as a body without a name, a set of measurements without a person attached, one of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of men in 18th and 19th century Britain who were turned into exhibitions before they were fully adults and who died young and who left behind, if they left behind anything at all, the record of their height and the date of their death. This video is about those men. It is about what was actually happening in those rooms and those fairground tents and those circus rings when ordinary British people paid to look at extraordinarily tall human beings. It is about the deep mythology that shaped what the audience thought they were seeing, which was almost never what they were actually seeing. It is about the medicine that was too late for every single one of the men it should have saved. It is about the institutions that wanted the bodies, both living and dead, and about what those institutions were willing to do to get them. And it is about the end of the story, which is not the end you might expect, because the story does not end in the Victorian fairground or the anatomist's workroom. It ends in a genetics laboratory in the 21st century, and the people at the center of that ending are alive, and some of them are alive specifically because of what was done to the men at the beginning of the story, which is perhaps the most complicated thing about this entire history, that the harm and the help are so thoroughly entangled that you cannot separate them without losing something essential from both. If this is the kind of history you want more of, please subscribe right now. Hit the bell so you do not miss what comes next. The history that gets buried is almost always more important than the history that gets taught, and this channel exists to dig it up. The link to the community and the further reading list are in the description below. Now, let us begin at the very beginning, which means we have to go back much further than the 19th century, back to the soil of Britain itself, back to the stories that were already old when the first exhibition giant arrived in London. Britain is a country that has believed in giants for longer than it has believed in almost anything else. The belief predates Christianity, predates Roman occupation, predates any written record that survives. It exists in the landscape itself, in the enormous earthworks that prehistoric peoples left across the face of the island, in the chalk figures carved into hillsides at a scale that implies either the participation of hundreds of people or the work of something very large and very determined. The Long Man of Wilmington in East Sussex nearly 300 feet tall in his hillside outline, looks down on the Sussex Weald with the placid authority of something that has been looking down for a very long time and has not been disturbed by anything it has seen. The Cerne Abbas, giant in Dorset, 180 feet from his feet to the top of his club, has stood on his chalk hill since a period that scholars date variously across several centuries and argue about with the particular passion of people who have spent too long on a single question and cannot agree on the answer. The Uffington White Horse in Oxfordshire, stylized and strange and unlike any animal that has actually lived, occupies its hillside with the confidence of something that was placed there by people who knew what they were doing and intended it to remain. These figures are not giants in the mythological sense, but they are made at giant scale, and the people who lived near them and looked at them for generation after generation in a period before literacy and before science, provided alternative explanations, could not help but ask who had made them, and the answer that came most naturally, given the scale, was that they had been made by people larger than the people currently alive, by a previous population of enormous beings who had preceded the ordinary world and left these enormous marks behind before they disappeared. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century, but drawing on oral traditions that reach back considerably further, gave this belief its most formal and influential literary expression. In his History of the Kings of Britain, which was not history in any modern sense, but which was read as history by the people who read it, the island of Albion before its colonization, by the Trojan exile, Brutus was inhabited exclusively by giants, creatures of enormous size and corresponding ferocity, who had to be defeated by Brutus and his followers before the island could be claimed for human habitation in the ordinary scale. The greatest of these giants was Gog-Magog, whose wrestling match with the hero Coroneus ended with Gog-Magog being thrown from a cliff near what is now Plymouth, and whose name was given to the site of his fall and echoed forward through centuries of British nomenclature until it became one of the paired wicker figures in the Lord Mayor's show in London, a ceremony that continues to the present day. Gog-Magog is still carried through the streets of London, transformed by the centuries from a terrifying adversary into a cheerful civic mascot, which is one of the more remarkable things that mythology does to its monsters when it has time to work on them. By the time the first giant exhibitions appeared in London in the 18th century, the mythology of the British giant had been active in the culture for hundreds of years, had been reinforced by a literary tradition that stretched from Geoffrey through Spenser's Fairy Queen to the giants of folklore and fairy tale that were still being told around fires in rural communities across the island. The giant in British cultural imagination was a specific and elaborated figure, ancient, powerful, connected to a world that had preceded the current one, and almost always, in the literary and folkloric tradition, ultimately defeated by ordinary human cleverness or virtue. The giant was an obstacle to be overcome, a representative of the old and excessive world against which the new and properly scaled world defined itself. This is the cultural apparatus that every paying customer brought with them when they walked through the door of a giant exhibition, and it shaped everything they saw and everything they felt and everything they reported seeing and feeling afterward. The man in the room was not simply a tall man. He was, in the operating mythology of the culture, a survivor of something that should have been entirely gone, a remnant that the proper course of history had somehow failed to eliminate, and the combination of wonder and unease that most accounts of these exhibitions describe in the audience was the specific affective response of people encountering something that their mythology told them should no longer exist, but that was undeniably, immediately, physically present in front of them. The commercial exploitation of this mythological response was not cynical, or not entirely cynical, because the promoters and managers who operated the exhibition business were themselves embedded in the same mythology as their customers and were responding to the same set of cultural cues. They chose the language they chose for their handbills because that language resonated with them as well as with their market. When a broadside of the 1780s described an exhibition giant as a true and living descendant of those tremendous beings who, in the days of Britain's infancy, walked these very lands, the writer of that broadside was not purely performing a commercial function. He was expressing a culturally available interpretation of the phenomenon in front of him, an interpretation that his audience would find legible and compelling because it was the interpretation that the culture had prepared for exactly this kind of encounter. The mythology and the commerce were not separate things operating in parallel. They were the same thing, the same cultural reflex expressed simultaneously as belief and as business. This is the context into which the first well-documented exhibition giants of the modern British period entered, and understanding it is essential to understanding everything about their lives and deaths, because it explains both the market that received them and the framework of ideas that surrounded them, and those two things together determined almost everything about what happened to them. The men themselves, as we will see, had very little control over the frameworks within which they were exhibited, the language used to describe them, or the institutional responses that their bodies provoked. They had even less control over what happened to those bodies after they died. But to understand why they had so little control requires understanding the enormous cultural and commercial and scientific machinery that was operating on them. And that machinery had its engine in the mythology of giants that Britain had been building for 1,000 years before any of them were born. The specific genetic story behind the concentration of exhibition giants in the British Isles, and particularly in Ireland, is one of the most fascinating developments in the recent medical and historical scholarship on this period, and it deserves extended treatment because it provides the biological explanation for a phenomenon that the 18th and 19th centuries explained in mythological terms, and that transforms the mythology in ways that are both more and less satisfying than the mythology itself. The condition that produced the extraordinarily tall men who were exhibited in this period is called pituitary gigantism, and it is caused, in the cases most relevant to this history, by a specific mutation in a gene called AIP, which stands for aryl hydrocarbon receptor interacting protein, a name that tells you nothing useful unless you are already a molecular biologist. What the mutation does is impair the normal function of a gene that regulates the activity of the pituitary gland, a pea-sized structure at the base of the brain that serves as the master controller of the body's endocrine system, regulating growth and metabolism and a dozen other vital functions through the hormones it produces and the hormones it directs other glands to produce. When the AIP gene is mutated in the relevant way, the pituitary gland is prone to developing benign tumors called adenomas, and when a pituitary adenoma produces excess growth hormone, and when that excess growth hormone reaches a body whose growth plates are still open, which is to say, a body that has not yet reached skeletal maturity, the result is gigantism. Growth that does not stop at the expected point and does not stop until something stops the growth hormone production, which in the absence of modern medical intervention means only death. The mutation responsible for this condition is found across many populations globally, but it occurs with unusual frequency in a specific region of Ireland, centred on County Tyrone and the surrounding areas of what is now Northern Ireland. This geographical clustering is not coincidental. It reflects the founding effect, the way that a rare mutation can become common in a population descended from a small number of ancestors, among whom the mutation happened to be present. At some point in the relatively deep history of the communities in that region, an individual carrying the AIP mutation founded or contributed to a lineage that became demographically significant in the area, and the mutation propagated through that lineage across generations until it was present at a frequency considerably higher than its frequency in the broader population. The result, across many generations, was a community in which the chances of inheriting the mutation were substantially higher than in most other places in the British Isles, and in which, therefore, the chances of producing a child who developed pituitary gigantism were substantially higher than normal. This does not mean that every very tall man from County Tyrone had the AIP mutation. Height varies for many reasons, and plenty of men from the region were simply tall in the ordinary genetic sense. But it does mean that the clustering of extremely tall men whose height far exceeded any normal genetic variation, and whose bodies showed the specific features of pituitary gigantism, the enlarged brow ridges, the prominent jaw, the enlarged hands and feet, was not random, but was the biological expression of a specific genetic inheritance, concentrated in specific communities by the ordinary processes of population genetics working across time. The giants who came to London from Ireland and stood in hired rooms near Charing Cross were not, in the mythological sense, the descendants of ancient giants. They were the descendants of a founding ancestor who had carried a variant of the AIP gene, and whose descendants had carried it forward across generations until it reached them, and they were the ones in whom it expressed itself most dramatically. While their cousins and siblings who had not inherited the mutation, or in whom it had not fully expressed, lived ordinary-sized lives in ordinary-sized houses, and are not part of this history. The man who stands at the beginning of the well-documented story of Irish giant exhibition in Britain is not Charles Byrne, though Byrne is the name most people encounter first. The better starting point is Cornelius Magrath, born in the 1730s in County Tipperary, who was brought to England as a child or young adolescent by Bishop Berkeley, the philosopher, in circumstances that the surviving record describes but does not fully explain. Berkeley was a man of genuine intellectual curiosity and real, if complicated, humanitarian impulse, and his involvement with Magrath seems to have been motivated by a combination of scientific interest and the kind of patronizing benevolence that 18th century men of his class and education frequently directed toward people they considered curiosities or objects of charitable concern. What Berkeley's involvement meant in practical terms was that Magrath was educated and housed and had a relationship with a figure of considerable social standing, which gave him a different entry into the exhibition world than most of his successors would have. He was exhibited in Dublin and in London, and was known to the natural philosophers of his day as a subject worthy of study, and he died at approximately 23 years old, and his skeleton was acquired by Trinity College, Dublin, where it still resides, and his story was largely forgotten outside specialist medical and historical circles until the scholarly interest in the broader history of giant exhibition began to grow in the late 20th century. What makes Magrath's story significant beyond its individual details is that it establishes, in compressed form, the template that would define the lives of the exhibition giants who followed him for the next 150 years. The template goes like this. A young man of extraordinary height comes from a rural Irish background, typically from circumstances of limited economic opportunity, and enters the exhibition world in a major city, typically London, typically in his late teens or early 20s. He is exhibited for a period ranging from months to a few years, generating income for himself and considerably more income for the promotional and commercial infrastructure that surrounds him. He is studied by physicians and natural philosophers who attend the exhibitions with professional interest and take measurements that they record in notebooks and eventually publish in medical literature. His health declines, which is the inevitable trajectory of pituitary gigantism in a period when no treatment exists for the condition, and the decline accelerates the more he has to stand for hours at a time in cold or damp rooms filled with strangers carrying their own diseases. He dies young, typically in his 20s or early 30s, There is a scramble for his body. His skeleton ends up in an anatomical collection. The promotional materials around his exhibition are collected by antiquarians and eventually end up in archives. And then the next man comes to London and the template repeats itself, with variations, but with the fundamental structure intact. Into this template stepped Charles Byrne in 1782, and while his story follows the template in most of its broad outlines, it diverges from it in the final act in a way that makes it the most morally complex and the most resonant story in the entire history of British giant exhibition. Byrne was born in 1761 in Littlebridge in County Tyrone, in the same general region that the modern genetic research has identified as the focal point of the AIP mutation cluster. He was, in the genetic sense, almost certainly a carrier of the same mutation that had produced the giant lineage of which he was the most famous representative, though the genetic confirmation of this did not come until the 21st century, when researchers extracted DNA from his skeleton and confirmed the presence of the AIP variant. He grew rapidly through childhood and adolescence, as all pituitary giants do, and by his late teens, he was already remarkable enough to have attracted attention in the communities around him. By the time he came to London in his early 20s, he was somewhere between 8 feet and 8 feet 4 inches tall, depending on which contemporary measurement you trust, and the variation in those measurements is itself revealing, because it suggests that his growth had not entirely ceased when the measurements were being taken, which is consistent with the biology of untreated pituitary gigantism, in which the excess growth hormone continues to drive skeletal growth as long as the adenoma is active. London in 1782 was a city of nearly 1 million people, the largest city in Europe, and one of the most commercially dynamic places on Earth. It was a city that had seen giants before, in the sense that the exhibition tradition was already established and the population was already familiar with the idea of paying to see remarkable bodies. But it was also a city that had never seen anything quite like Charles Byrne, or if it had, the record of it has not survived, because the accounts of Byrne's exhibitions are notable for the consistency of their emphasis on the extreme quality of his height, the sense communicated by multiple independent observers that even within the tradition of giant exhibition, which had been preparing the audience for extraordinary height, Byrne was genuinely extraordinary. He advertised in the London newspapers, specifically in the notices sections that served as the social media of the 18th century city, and the advertisements drew crowds that paid 2 shillings and 6 each to stand in a room with him and look at him and ask him questions about his diet and his family and his origins. The exhibitions were held in a sequence of hired rooms in the West End, in the areas near Charing Cross and the Haymarket, that were already established as entertainment districts and that had the foot traffic and the social infrastructure to support a paying exhibition. The rooms had to be found with care, because Charles Byrne needed a room with ceilings high enough to permit him to stand upright, and not every available room in the city met that specification. The logistics of renting and furnishing and heating an exhibition room for a man of his dimensions were a constant practical challenge that the historical accounts mostly ignore, but that shaped the day-to-day reality of his life in London more than almost any other single factor. The chair he sat in between exhibitions had to be custom-made or reinforced. The bed in whatever lodging he occupied had to be extended or improvised. Every ordinary domestic and commercial arrangement had to be renegotiated from scratch. Among the people who paid their 2 shillings and 6 and walked through the door to look at Charles Byrne was John Hunter, and the story of what happened between them is the story that more than any other defines the moral character of the British giant exhibition tradition. Hunter was by 1782 one of the most distinguished surgeons and anatomists in Britain. He had built his reputation on a philosophy of empirical investigation that was, for its time, genuinely revolutionary. The idea that understanding the living body required systematic study of the dead body, that the mechanisms of disease and health could only be discovered by cutting things open and looking at what was inside, and that the pursuit of this knowledge was more important than any social or ethical convention that might stand in its way. This philosophy had made him one of the most important figures in the history of British medicine. It had also made him a man who was accustomed to pursuing the specimens he wanted with whatever means were available, and who had developed a collector's psychology in which the identification of a desired specimen and the eventual acquisition of that specimen were steps 1 and 2 of an inevitable process. Hunter identified Charles Byrne as a desired specimen before Byrne died. This was not unusual in itself. Hunter attended the exhibitions of many unusual people and assessed their potential scientific value. What was unusual in Byrne's case was the energy and the money that Hunter was eventually willing to expend to ensure he got what he wanted. The offer he made, through intermediaries during Byrne's lifetime, of purchasing the body after death, was communicated to Byrne and was received by him with the specific kind of dread that the proposition warranted. To understand why Byrne found this so frightening requires understanding the cultural and religious context of the period, in which dissection after death was not understood as a medical procedure, but as a violation of the body's integrity with implications for the soul's afterlife. The Murder Act of 1752 had formalized this understanding by making dissection an additional punishment available for convicted murderers, a punishment beyond death itself, an extension of the judicial condemnation into the body's post-mortem existence. In the popular imagination, which the Murder Act had both reflected and reinforced, dissection was what happened to criminals, to the condemned, to the people whom society had placed entirely outside the boundaries of normal human regard. For a man who was not a criminal, who was simply trying to make a living from the only asset his body had given him, the prospect of being treated after death as the law treated murderers was not a metaphorical indignity. It was a visceral, religious, personal terror. Byrne made arrangements. He communicated his wishes to the people around him. The Irish community in London, in which he had social connections, the friends and associates who formed his circle in the city. He specified, with the precision of a man who understood clearly what was at risk, that he wanted to be buried at sea, carried in a lead-lined coffin to water deep enough that no anatomist could reach him, placed beyond the reach of the institutions that had followed him from his arrival in the city, with the patience and the appetite of something that expected eventually to be fed. He set money aside for this purpose. He designated people he trusted to carry it out. These preparations were not the preparations of a man who was uncertain about his fate. They were the preparations of a man who was entirely certain and who was trying, with the limited resources available to him, to prevent the thing he was certain about from happening. He died in June of 1783. He was 22 years old. The official cause was tuberculosis, though the modern medical reading of his skeleton suggests that the cardiovascular stress of his gigantism was a significant contributing factor, and his known heavy drinking in the final years of his life was both a symptom of his deteriorating health and an additional burden on a body already under enormous strain. John Hunter paid £500 to the undertakers to divert the body. £500 was, in 1783, a sum equivalent to many years of ordinary wages for a skilled working man, and it is a measure of how badly Hunter wanted the skeleton, and of how confident he was in the absolute primacy of his scientific interest over any other consideration, that he was willing to spend that sum, rather than accept that a clearly expressed human wish might constitute an obstacle he could not overcome. The body went to Hunter's house in Leicester Square instead of to the sea. Within months, the skeleton was prepared, articulated, and mounted. Within a few years, it was on display in Hunter's museum. In the 19th century, the museum was transferred to the Royal College of Surgeons in Lincoln's Inn Fields, where the skeleton of Charles Byrne still stands today, 8 feet tall in a glass case, in the building where he stands because of the failure of every institution around him to treat his wishes as having the slightest moral weight. The question of what should happen to Charles Byrne's skeleton now is a live ethical debate in British cultural and medical institutions, and it has been for decades, and its continuing unresolved state is itself a kind of answer, though not the right one. The Royal College of Surgeons has acknowledged the problematic nature of the acquisition while maintaining the skeleton on display and available for research, a position that critics have described, with some justice, as having the skeleton and acknowledging the wrong simultaneously without allowing the acknowledgement to change anything. The scientific argument for retaining the skeleton rests primarily on its value for ongoing research into pituitary gigantism and the AIP mutation, research that has generated real clinical benefits for living people who carry the mutation and are at risk of developing pituitary adenomas. This is a genuine consideration, not merely an institutional excuse. The research that has used Byrne's skeleton directly and as the catalyst for a broader genetic investigation of the communities from which he came has identified living people in Ireland and the Irish diaspora who carry the AIP mutation and who have been screened and in some cases treated for early pituitary tumours that might otherwise have progressed to cause serious harm. Charles Byrne's stolen skeleton has, in this specific and quantifiable sense, saved lives. The fact that those lives were saved through the application of knowledge derived from a specimen obtained without consent, and against the explicit and clearly expressed wishes of the person whose remains it was, does not diminish the benefit to the living. But it does not resolve the moral question either. The argument that the scientific value of wrongfully obtained remains can justify their continued use and retention is an argument that has been made in other contexts in other parts of the world, in relation to indigenous remains collected during colonial expeditions, in relation to anatomical specimens acquired from the bodies of the poor and marginalized in periods when the law did not protect them, and in those contexts the argument has been increasingly rejected by the international community as insufficient to overcome the basic claim of the dead to be treated with the respect they were denied in life. Why the case of Charles Byrne should be resolved differently from those cases is a question that the Royal College of Surgeons has not answered in a way that most of those who have examined it closely find satisfying. The skeleton of Patrick Cotter O'Brien, who was born in Kinsale in County Cork around 1760 and who reached a height of somewhere between 7 feet 10 and 8 feet 1, was not stolen. Cotter O'Brien managed to do what Byrne could not. He protected his own body after death. He was buried in Clifton, in Bristol, where he had spent much of his working life, in a coffin encased in multiple protective layers, and when his grave was examined centuries later, the bones were found undisturbed, which is to say that his instructions were followed and his body stayed where he put it. The contrast with Byrne is not accidental. Cotter O'Brien had the benefit of several more years of life and experience than Byrne had, and he used those years to accumulate sufficient resources and sufficient social connections to ensure that his burial wishes were carried out effectively. He had also, by the time he was making those arrangements, seen what had happened to Byrne, and the lesson was not lost on him. Cotter O'Brien's exhibition career was longer and in some respects more financially successful than Byrne's, partly because he lived longer and partly because he managed his own affairs with more commercial sophistication. He had initially been contracted to an exhibitor under terms he found exploitative, terms that he had signed without fully understanding their implications, and his eventual escape from that contract by buying it out represents one of the more assertive acts of self-determination in the exhibition tradition. After the buyout, he managed his own exhibitions, negotiated his own fees, and arranged his own touring itinerary, which gave him considerably more control over his income and over the conditions of his exhibition than most of his contemporaries experienced. He was exhibited in London and in various provincial British cities, and was known as a figure of commercial significance in the entertainment world of the early 19th century. He died in 1806 at approximately 46 years old, which was genuinely old for an exhibition giant of his era, and he left a will that is notable for the careful protective language around his burial. The will of a man who had understood for decades what the institutions around him wanted from his body, and who had spent those decades making sure they would not get it. William Bradley, born in 1787 in Market Weighton in the East Riding of Yorkshire, has a different kind of story from the Irish giants, not because his condition was different, but because his relationship to his home community was different. Bradley grew up in Market Weighton and was tall from childhood in the way that all pituitary giants are tall from childhood, and he became, within his community, a figure of local distinction long before he became a figure of wider celebrity. The East Riding farming community in which he grew up had its own ways of understanding and accommodating unusual bodies, ways that were less mediated by the London exhibition machinery and less shaped by the specific Irish mythological framework that surrounded the County Tyrone giants, and Bradley's relationship to his own remarkableness seems to have been somewhat different as a result, more local and more personal, and less thoroughly commodified than the experience of the men who came to London from abroad and had no home community to return to. He was exhibited, of course. The economic logic of the exhibition world was compelling enough to draw Bradley into it, as it drew almost everyone of his height and era into it, and he appeared in London and in various English cities as the Yorkshire Giant, a billing that positioned him within the mythological framework of the giant tradition, while also giving him a regional identity that was more grounded than the generic Irish giant designation. He seems to have been, by the accounts that survive, a person of genuine warmth and easy manner, the kind of person who could stand in a room being looked at and find a way to make the experience tolerable for himself and for the people looking at him. He died in 1820 at the age of 33, which was relatively old for an exhibition giant, and his grave in Market Weighton is maintained and visited, and the town holds an annual celebration of his memory that has become one of the more charming pieces of local historical culture in Yorkshire, a community claiming, with real affection, a man whose body made his life difficult, but who was, by all the evidence, a person worth claiming. The Victorian era proper, the long middle decades of the 19th century, saw the exhibition tradition reach its commercial peak and begin its slow decline, and the two processes were more closely related than they might initially appear. The commercial peak was driven by several converging factors. The growth of the urban population, which expanded the potential audience for paid entertainment dramatically. The development of the railway network, which made the national touring circuit commercially feasible for the first time. The expansion of the popular press, which could promote exhibitions to audiences across the country. And the influence of P.T. Barnum, the American showman who brought his own model of exhibition entertainment to Britain multiple times, and whose approach to promotional mythology raised the commercial temperature of the whole sector. Barnum understood, with a shrewdness that his contemporary critics underestimated and his historical admirers sometimes overstate, that the story wrapped around an exhibit was as commercially important as the exhibit itself, that audiences would pay more for a dramatically framed phenomenon than for a merely visually remarkable one, and that the dramatic frame could be constructed from materials that were entirely invented as long as they were internally coherent and emotionally resonant. His approach to the exhibition of very tall people, of whom he exhibited several in the United States, and who appeared under his promotional influence in Britain, was to embed them in narratives that gave their height a significance beyond the merely biological. Giants in the Barnum tradition were not people with a medical condition. They were representatives of something larger, literally and figuratively, than the ordinary world. They were the last of an ancient race, the sole survivors of a bloodline that stretched back to biblical times, the living proof of a world that had once been grander and stranger than the diminished present. This framing was not original to Barnum, of course. It was the same mythology that had been operating in British Giant exhibition since the 18th century. What Barnum did was professionalize it, systematize it, and apply it with a promotional intensity and a commercial infrastructure that gave it a reach and a durability that earlier, more artisanal approaches to exhibition mythology had not achieved. The British exhibition industry absorbed Barnum's influence selectively. Some promoters adopted his approach wholesale, constructing elaborate biographical fictions for their exhibition subjects and promoting them with the full apparatus of advance publicity and newspaper controversy and staged events that Barnum had developed. Others retained a more traditionally British approach, which relied somewhat more on the prestige of scientific endorsement and somewhat less on pure mythological inflation. Presenting exhibition subjects as objects of natural philosophical interest as well as visual spectacle. The two approaches were not mutually exclusive and frequently coexisted in the promotion of a single exhibition, with different audiences receiving different framings of the same body, depending on what they were looking for and what they were prepared to pay for. Anna Haining Swan, who came to Britain from Canada in the early 1870s as part of an international tour arranged under Barnum's influence, was in many ways the most interesting figure in the Victorian-era giant exhibition tradition, precisely because she did not fit the template established by the Irish giants of the previous century. She was a woman, which was unusual in a tradition dominated by men. She was educated to a standard that most of her exhibition predecessors were not. Having attended school in Nova Scotia and developed genuine intellectual interest and accomplishments that she was willing and able to display alongside her physical remarkableness. She was nearly 8 feet tall, making her legitimately extraordinary by any standard of measurement, and she had, through her association with Barnum and through her own considerable intelligence, developed a public persona that was more complex and more active than the personas of most exhibition subjects of her era. A persona that presented her as a person of substance and accomplishment, who happened also to be very tall, rather than as a body whose height was the whole of her public existence. Her exhibitions in Britain included lecture components, in which she spoke to the audience about her life and her experiences and her views on various matters, a format that was unusual in the giant exhibition tradition and that served multiple functions simultaneously. It satisfied the audience's curiosity about what a very tall person thought and felt, which was curiosity that the traditional exhibition format entirely suppressed. It positioned Swan as an active participant in the construction of her own public image rather than a passive object of display. It distinguished her exhibitions from the purely visual spectacle of the typical freak show format and gave them a quality of intellectual engagement that made them more acceptable to audiences who were beginning to feel uncomfortable with straightforward human exhibition. And it gave Swan herself some degree of control over her own narrative, which was not available to most of the men who had preceded her in the British exhibition tradition, and who had been exhibited within narratives entirely constructed by others without their meaningful participation. Swan eventually married another exhibition giant, Martin Van Buren Bates, a Nova Scotian who stood around 7 feet 2 and who had been exhibited in America and Europe as the Kentucky Giant or the Nova Scotia Giant, depending on which billing his current promoters preferred. Their marriage, which was celebrated with considerable press attention on both sides of the Atlantic, was presented to the public as the ultimate exhibition spectacle, the meeting of the two tallest people in the world and their union as a couple, and the promotional machinery around it was considerable and quite deliberately orchestrated. But beneath the promotional framing was a genuine relationship between two people who shared the specific experience of navigating an ordinary-sized world in bodies that were not ordinary-sized, and who had found in each other a companionship and a mutual understanding. That is, when you look at the documentary record of their life together, clearly more than a commercial arrangement. They eventually retired from exhibition, built a house in Ohio designed to their own dimensions, and lived there until their deaths. The house had 9-foot ceilings and custom furniture and a bed that was actually long enough, and it was the first place in their adult lives where the built environment was calibrated to them rather than to the statistical majority. And by all the accounts that survived from people who visited them there, they were happy in it. The medical history of gigantism as a formal scientific understanding developed with extraordinary slowness across the 19th century, which is to say, it developed at the pace of all Victorian medical advance, which was considerable compared to earlier periods, but agonizingly inadequate compared to what was needed by the people the medicine was supposed to serve. The pituitary gland, which sits at the base of the brain in a small bony cavity called the sella turcica, was known as a structure throughout the period, having been described in anatomical literature since the Renaissance, but its function as the master regulator of the body's hormonal system was entirely unknown through most of the 19th century. The concept of a hormone, a chemical messenger produced in one part of the body and carried in the blood to regulate processes in another part, did not exist in medical science until the very end of the 19th century, and the identification of growth hormone specifically, and of its role in regulating skeletal growth came even later. The key intellectual moment in the history of gigantism as a medical understanding was Pierre Marie's description of acromegaly in 1886, published in a French medical journal and translated and discussed in the British medical press within a few years. Acromegaly, which is the adult form of excess growth hormone production, in which the growth plates have already closed so that the excess hormone causes distinctive changes in the facial bones and extremities rather than dramatic increase in height, was the first condition whose connection to the pituitary gland was clearly established. Marie identified, through pathological examination of acromegalic patients who had died, that they consistently showed enlargement of the pituitary gland, and he proposed, with the cautious language of a scientist who knew he was suggesting something significant, that the pituitary enlargement was the cause of the condition rather than an incidental finding. The proposal was contested and debated across the following years, but by the mid-1890s it was increasingly accepted, and with its acceptance came the beginning of the recognition that the pituitary gland was a structure of enormous physiological importance whose malfunction could produce dramatic and devastating consequences for the body. For the exhibition giants of the 19th century, most of whom were dead by the time these medical advances were made, the science came too late to mean anything in practical terms. But for the people who came after them, the science pointed toward eventual therapeutic options that the giants themselves could not have imagined. Surgery on the pituitary gland, which sits at the base of the brain in its bony enclosure, was essentially impossible with the surgical techniques of the 19th century without unacceptable mortality risk. But the development of transsphenoidal surgical approaches in the early 20th century, which reached the pituitary through the nasal passages and sinuses rather than through the skull, eventually made pituitary surgery a viable option for patients with adenomas. The subsequent development of pharmaceutical treatments, particularly the somatostatin analogues that can suppress growth hormone production in many patients with pituitary adenomas, added non-surgical options that are less invasive and often highly effective. Today, a child with pituitary gigantism, identified early through genetic screening or clinical observation, can be treated with a combination of surgery, medication, and monitoring that prevents the dramatic progression of the condition and allows them to live a life whose length and quality would have been incomprehensible to Charles Byrne. The connection between this modern therapeutic landscape and the history of the exhibition giants passes through the genetics laboratory and through the ongoing scientific use of the remains that the exhibition tradition left behind. In 2011, a group of researchers published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine describing their analysis of the AIP mutation in a cohort of patients with familial pituitary gigantism, tracing the mutation through historical records and family histories to a likely founding ancestor in Northern Ireland in the 18th century. The paper used genetic material extracted from several museum specimens, including the skeleton of Charles Byrne, to establish the presence of the mutation in individuals from the historical exhibition period and to link the historical cases to the living population carrying the mutation. The research confirmed that the concentration of exhibition giants in 18th and 19th century Britain was indeed the expression of a single genetic founding event that had propagated through specific Irish communities across generations, exactly as the analysis of the exhibition geography had long suggested. The research program that has grown from this work has now identified hundreds of living individuals who carry the AIP mutation. Through a combination of genealogical research, population genetic screening, and the clinical presentation of individuals who develop symptoms of pituitary disease. Among these hundreds of individuals, many have been found to have pituitary adenomas, some of which have been treated before they caused significant harm. The clinical benefit of this identification and treatment is real and quantifiable, and it is rooted, ultimately, in the scientific investigation that began with the exhibition giants and their stolen skeletons. The bodies that were taken from those men without their consent have, through a process that has taken 2 centuries to complete, been used to protect the bodies of their genetic descendants. This is not a comfortable thing to say, and it is not meant to be. It is simply what happened. The daily experience of being an exhibition giant in Victorian Britain was shaped by a set of physical realities that the historical record mostly obscures, because the people who generated the historical record, the newspaper reporters and the natural philosophers and the exhibition promoters, were not interested in the daily experience. They were interested in the measurements, the biographical details that could be dressed up as mythology, the commercial transactions. The person inside the remarkable body was incidental to their purposes, and so the person inside the remarkable body is mostly absent from the record. What we can reconstruct from the fragments that do survive and from the medical understanding of what pituitary gigantism actually does to the body is a picture of daily life that was marked by chronic pain, by physical limitation, by the constant negotiation with an environment that had not been built for anything close to the dimensions the giants occupied. The joint pain was probably the most pervasive physical reality. The skeleton of a man of 8 feet is bearing a weight and distributing mechanical forces across joints that human skeletons are simply not designed for at that scale. The knees, the hips, the lower spine, all of the weight-bearing joints were under stresses that produced the kind of chronic inflammation and degradation that we associate with severe arthritis in much older, ordinary-sized people. The giants of the exhibition tradition were experiencing this kind of joint damage in their early 20s, in bodies that were, in every other respect, young, which meant that they had young bodies' propensity for activity combined with a skeletal system that was already breaking down under impossible mechanical demands. The walking that the exhibition circuit required, the standing for hours in exhibition rooms, the travel between venues, all of this was conducted in the context of this chronic joint pain, and the walking and the standing made the pain worse, and the worse pain made the walking and the standing harder, and the cumulative effect over years was a physical deterioration that is clearly visible in the bones of the giants who have been examined by modern osteoarchaeologists, who find in those bones the markers of the joint stress and the degenerative changes that document what the daily experience of extraordinary height in an ordinary-sized world actually felt like. The cardiovascular strain was less visible to contemporaries, but equally devastating. The human heart is designed, in a general evolutionary sense, for the height range that the vast majority of humans occupy, and it manages the demands of that height range effectively across a normal lifespan. At 8 feet, the demands are categorically different. The heart must pump blood not just to the extremities, but to extremities that are significantly further away than any normal human heart has to reach, against a gravitational gradient that is substantially steeper than normal. The result is cardiac strain that manifests as hypertension, as ventricular enlargement, and eventually as heart failure, and that begins to accumulate from the moment the body reaches the height at which the demands exceed what the cardiac system can sustainably manage. Most of the giants of the exhibition tradition died of what contemporary physicians recorded as dropsy or apoplexy or consumption, which were the period's diagnostic categories for a constellation of cardiovascular symptoms that we would now recognize as congestive heart failure combined with the pulmonary and vascular complications of chronic hypertension. They were dying, in plain terms, because their hearts could not keep up with their bodies, and there was nothing that medicine of their era could have done about this, even if it had understood what was happening. The headaches deserve a paragraph of their own, because they represent one of the most specific and tormenting features of pituitary gigantism as a lived experience, and because they are almost entirely absent from the historical accounts of the exhibition giants, despite being a universal feature of the condition. Pituitary adenomas, as they grow, press against the optic chiasm, the crossing point of the optic nerves directly above the pituitary gland, and this pressure produces a specific pattern of visual field loss called bitemporal hemianopia, in which the outer visual field in both eyes progressively disappears. The adenomas also produce headaches that are characteristically severe and persistent, located in the forehead and temples, and that worsen as the tumor grows. These headaches are documented in modern clinical descriptions of pituitary gigantism as one of the most debilitating aspects of the condition. For the exhibition giants, standing for hours in crowded rooms while strangers pressed close and stared, these headaches were a constant background reality that the handbills never mentioned and that the newspaper accounts never described, because the narrative of the exhibition required a figure of impressive, monumental health, not a young man in chronic pain who could see only the central portion of what was in front of him and who had to concentrate to track the movement of the people approaching from the sides. The drinking that several of the exhibition giants engaged in, and which was noted with disapproval by some contemporaries, makes complete sense in this context. Alcohol was the most easily available and most socially acceptable form of pain management in 18th and 19th century Britain, and the pain that needed managing was real, constant, and otherwise entirely unaddressed. The laudanum, tincture of opium in alcohol, that was the pharmacist's main offering for chronic pain, was also probably used by some of the giants, and the combination of laudanum and alcohol was itself a health hazard in a body already under cardiac and hepatic strain. The self-medication of chronic untreated pain with the tools available is not a character failing. It is a rational response to an impossible situation, and the tendency of contemporary accounts to note the drinking as a personality flaw, rather than as a medical symptom, is itself a form of the same moral obtuseness that characterized the broader relationship between the exhibition industry and the people it exhibited. The social isolation of the exhibition giants in London was a form of suffering that is harder to document than the physical suffering, but that was probably as significant. These were young men, most of them, who had grown up in tight-knit rural communities where they were known and in most cases genuinely cared for, who came to London seeking economic opportunity and found themselves in a city of nearly 1 million people, where they knew almost nobody, and where every person they met for the first time was responding to their height rather than to them as individuals. The Irish community in London was a resource for some of them, a social network that provided connection and support and some degree of protection. But it was not a substitute for the family and community they had left behind. And the experience of being in London as an exhibition giant, of being permanently, visibly, involuntarily remarkable in a city that commodified remarkableness, was a specific kind of loneliness that is not well captured by any of the surviving accounts. The Bartholomew Fair, which had been operating at Smithfield in London since the 12th century, provided the primary institutional venue for giant exhibition in the pre-Victorian period and through the first half of the 19th century. The fair was a massive, chaotic, multi-day event held in August each year that combined a legitimate commercial market with an entertainment zone of extraordinary density and variety. By the 18th century, the entertainment component had largely overwhelmed the commercial component, at least in public perception, and the fair was known primarily as a place where you could see virtually anything that fell outside the ordinary range of human experience. Theatrical performances, acrobats, animals trained to perform human tasks, mechanical wonders, optical illusions, and human beings whose bodies were remarkable in one way or another. Giants were a recurring presence at the fair over its long history, exhibited in the wooden booths that lined the fair's lanes in temporary but surprisingly well-constructed structures designed to maximize the paying audience's access to the exhibit while maintaining enough of a barrier to create the theatrical tension that exhibition required. The fair ended in 1855 when the City of London Corporation decided that its combination of commercial disruption, public disorder, and moral hazard was no longer compatible with the improving sensibility of the Victorian city. The decision to end it was not made primarily on humanitarian grounds, which would have required the reformers to articulate a coherent argument about the ethics of human exhibition that they were not yet ready to make explicitly. It was made on grounds of public order and civic aesthetics. The argument that the fair attracted the wrong kind of people and generated the wrong kind of behavior in an area that was now surrounded by respectable commercial and residential property. The giants who had made their living at the fair were therefore displaced into a commercial landscape that was changing rapidly, moving toward the music hall and the variety theatre, and, later, the permanent circus. Venues that had different physical parameters and different audience demographics, and that required somewhat different forms of exhibition than the fair's temporary booth format had demanded. The displacement of the exhibition tradition from the fair into the music hall and variety theatre was part of a broader transformation of British popular entertainment in the Victorian period that is well documented in cultural history, but whose specific implications for the giant exhibition tradition have not always been traced carefully. The music hall format, which developed rapidly from the 1850s onward, and which by the 1880s had become the dominant form of popular entertainment in Britain, was fundamentally a format of variety, a succession of different acts in a single venue, and the exhibition of an unusual human body fit into this format as one act among many, sandwiched between a comedian and a performing animal, and a singer and a magic act. The integration of the giant exhibition into the variety format changed its character in ways that were not always obvious at the time, but that are clear in retrospect. It made the exhibition shorter and more theatrical, because the audience needed to be held for the duration of the act and then released cleanly for the next act. It increased the pressure on the exhibition subject to perform rather than merely to be visible, to have a stage presence and a patter and an ability to manage a large and often noisy room. And it placed the exhibition in a commercial context in which it was one competitive offering among many, which had implications for both the promotional framing and the financial arrangements. The performing giant of the Victorian Music Hall was therefore a somewhat different figure from the static exhibition giant of the earlier period, and the men who were successfully exhibited in this format were those who could combine the visual impact of extraordinary height with the performative skills of a stage entertainer. Some of them were genuinely talented performers who developed acts that used their height as a theatrical resource while also displaying other abilities. Some were primarily interesting as visual phenomena and were exhibited in formats that limited the theatrical demands on them. And some found the transition from the static exhibition format to the dynamic variety format genuinely difficult, because the skills required were different, and not everyone had them, and the alternative of returning to the earlier format of the hired room was commercially marginal in a city that now had the music hall. The class dimension of the Victorian giant exhibition tradition ran through every aspect of it, from the ticket price to the institutional response to the dead body, and it is worth dwelling on explicitly because it is the dimension that most clearly explains the power dynamics at work. The men who were exhibited came overwhelmingly from poor and working class backgrounds. The poverty that brought them to the exhibition economy was not incidental to the story. It was structural. A man of 8 feet in the Victorian period had extremely limited options for earning a living through any of the channels that ordinary men used, because the work available to ordinary men required a body that fitted into the physical infrastructure of employment, the factory floor, the agricultural field, the skilled artisan's workshop, all of which were built for ordinary-sized bodies and could not easily accommodate bodies that were categorically different. The exhibition economy was one of the few available channels through which extraordinary height could be converted into income, and the men who used that channel did so because the alternatives were worse, not because the exhibition economy offered them a fair or dignified arrangement. The promoters and exhibition managers who profited from the arrangement were in almost all cases better off economically than the men they managed, and in many cases significantly better off. The commercial infrastructure of the exhibition world, the printers of the handbills and broadsides, the keepers of the exhibition rooms, the travel agents who arranged the touring circuits, the newspaper men who wrote the promotional notices, all of them took a share of the revenue that the giant generated without putting their own bodies into the arrangement. The giant himself received a portion of the income, typically under the terms of a contract that he had often signed without fully understanding its implications, because he had no access to legal advice and because the market for his services was narrow enough that the promoters had most of the negotiating power. The financial outcome for the giants was rarely good in the long term. Short-term income could be substantial, but the physical decline that ended the exhibition career typically came before any significant savings had accumulated, and the social safety net available to an Irish immigrant in London who was too ill to work was essentially non-existent. The scientific institutions that wanted the bodies of the dead giants were also drawing on a form of class power, the power of education and institutional authority, to override the expressed wishes of people who had no institutional standing to enforce those wishes. John Hunter's £500 was not the only mechanism by which the bodies of exhibition giants found their way into anatomical collections. The bodies of poor people who died in cities and whose families could not afford private burial were routinely acquired by anatomists through the workhouse and hospital system. And very tall poor people who died in cities were acquired with particular enthusiasm because their bodies were of particular scientific interest. The legal framework that was supposed to protect the bodies of the dead from dissection against the wishes of their families or their own expressed intentions was widely ignored in practice because the enforcement mechanism was inadequate and because the social pressure against anatomists was insufficient to outweigh the scientific and commercial incentives driving the acquisition. The Anatomy Act of 1832, passed in response to the scandal of the Burke and Hare murders in Edinburgh in 1828, in which bodies were provided to anatomists not through grave robbery, but through murder, was intended to solve the body supply problem for anatomists by making the bodies of people who died in workhouses legally available for dissection unless they had made explicit arrangements otherwise. It did not solve the ethical problem of acquiring bodies without meaningful consent. It formalized a system in which the bodies of the poor were treated as a resource for the scientific education of the professional class, and in which the exemptions available to those with resources, private burial in a secure grave, iron coffins, family watches, were not available to those without. The exhibition giants who died in London, lodging houses in conditions of marginal poverty, were therefore in double jeopardy. Their bodies were more desirable to anatomists than ordinary bodies, and they were less able to protect those bodies than people with greater social and economic resources. The end of the British giant exhibition tradition came not with a single decisive moment, but with a gradual diminishment across the last 2 decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th. A slow retreat of the commercial form from the cultural landscape that it had occupied so prominently for 150 years. The cinema was the most significant disruptive force, appearing in Britain in the late 1890s and providing a form of visual spectacle that was more scalable, more reproducible, and ultimately more compelling than anything that could be arranged in a hired room or a music hall stage. The cinema could show its audience anything, at any scale, and it could show it in a darkened room with perfect consistency across multiple performances and multiple venues, which no live exhibition could match for reliability or for the specific kind of visual immersion that darkness and a large screen provided. The cultural shift in attitudes toward the exhibition of human difference was slower than the technological shift, but ultimately more decisive. By the early 20th century, the critique of freak shows and related exhibition formats as exploitative and undignified had become a recurring feature of public discourse, appearing in newspapers and in medical journals and in the emerging social reform literature, in ways that it had not appeared a generation earlier. The specific language of exploitation, the argument that the people exhibited were being deprived of their dignity and their privacy for the commercial benefit of others, was beginning to be used not only by religious reformers whose primary concern was moral decency, but by physicians and social commentators whose framework was more secular and whose arguments were more directly addressed to the power dynamics of the exhibition relationship. This shift in public discourse did not immediately produce legislative change or institutional reform, but it changed the social atmosphere around exhibition in ways that made it increasingly difficult to sustain. What remained after the formal exhibition tradition ended was a legacy that continues to generate ethical and historical questions that have not been fully resolved. The skeletons in the museum cases are the most tangible element of that legacy, but they are not the whole of it. The measurements in the medical literature, the entries in the exhibition records, the portraits and illustrations in archives across the country, the broadsides in the collections of the British Library, all of these constitute a documentary record of the exhibition tradition that preserves, in compressed and partial form, the stories of the men and women who were its subject matter. That record is incomplete in its most important dimension, the inner lives of the people it describes, but it is extensive enough to make a serious historical reconstruction possible, and the historical reconstruction reveals a tradition that was more complex, more ambiguous, and more ethically troubling than the simple narrative of Victorian entertainment might suggest. The people who were exhibited were real people, with names and families and preferences and fears, and the thing that the exhibition tradition consistently did to them was to reduce them to a single physical dimension while erasing or ignoring everything else. The man who stood in the room and was charged to be looked at was, for the purposes of the exhibition, entirely his height. His intelligence, his personality, his emotional life, his preferences and opinions and experiences, all of these were beside the point. The point was the body. The point was always the body. And the insistence on recovering the person from behind the measurements, on restoring the name to the body and the inner life to the name, is not a sentimental impulse. It is the minimum ethical requirement for engaging seriously with this history. The names are mostly known, for the major figures at least: Charles Byrne, Patrick Cotter O'Brien, Cornelius McGrath, William Bradley, Anna Haining Swan, Frederick Kempster, and behind them, dozens of others: the Caledonian Colossus in his Edinburgh room, the unnamed giant of Southwark Fair, the man described in a Bristol newspaper in 1822 as the tallest person ever seen in the west of England, whose name the newspaper did not think worth recording. They were real. They were all real. The measurements were taken from real bodies, and the dates of death were recorded for real people, and the institutions that now hold their bones are holding the bones of real people who had opinions about where they should rest. Acknowledging that reality, living with the discomfort of what it implies about the institutions and the traditions that produced this history, and insisting that the discomfort not be resolved prematurely through easy narrative closure, is what serious engagement with this history requires. The giants of Victorian Britain were the last of something, and the question of what exactly they were the last of is the question this video has been circling. They were the last generation of people with the specific genetic inheritance that produced pituitary gigantism at the rate it was produced in those particular Irish communities. Before the population dispersions of the 19th century diluted and scattered what the centuries had concentrated. They were the last people whose extraordinary height could be understood, by themselves and by the culture around them, primarily through a mythological rather than a medical framework. The last people who stood in a room and were read as living remnants of an ancient and larger world, before the science that explained what they actually were caught up with the reality of what they were experiencing. They were the last people for whom the exhibition economy was the only viable channel for the conversion of extraordinary height into economic survival, before the combination of cultural change and legal reform and expanded employment options made other ways of living available. And they were the last people to live without the medical intervention that could have saved them. The last generation before the knowledge existed to prevent the condition from killing them at 22. In every sense, they stood at the end of something and the beginning of something else, and they carried that double position in their bodies without being able to know it or name it or do anything about it. They were the hinge of a history that was turning, the last figures in one story and the founding figures in another, and the debt we owe them is the debt of any history to the people who paid for the future with their present, who were the price of a knowledge they never got to use, who died in cold rooms in a city that paid to look at them, and whose names we should know and whose wishes we have not yet entirely honored. They deserve more than the measurements. They always did. If this video reached you, please share it. The histories that get buried are the ones that need the most active sharing to stay visible. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and look at the description for everything that goes deeper. The next story is already waiting. The newspaper culture of 18th and 19th century Britain was the essential infrastructure on which the giant exhibition business depended, and its role in shaping the public understanding of extraordinary height deserves extended treatment. The newspapers of the period were not the neutral informational instruments that later journalism would aspire to be. They were simultaneously commercial enterprises dependent on advertising revenue, political instruments in the service of various factions and interests, and social institutions whose coverage of any given phenomenon both reflected and shaped the cultural response to it. Their coverage of the giant exhibitions was consequently multiple and simultaneous in its functions. It promoted the exhibitions commercially. It provided the cultural framework within which the exhibitions were to be understood, and it contributed to the construction of the exhibition subject's public persona in ways that the exhibition subject typically had little ability to influence or correct. The newspapers understood the commercial dimension of giant exhibition coverage clearly enough to distinguish between news coverage, which was free, and advertising, which was paid, and which appeared in the notice columns and the classified sections in the language of promotional hyperbole that the period had developed for this purpose. But the news coverage and the advertising were not as distinct as those categories might suggest, because the same promotional framing, the same mythological vocabulary, the same emphasis on the extraordinary rather than the ordinary ran through both. A newspaper report of a new giant exhibition in London typically described the subject in the language of wonder, citing measurements, speculating on origins, placing the phenomenon within the framework of natural philosophy, or, increasingly through the 19th century, the framework of natural history, which the Darwinian Revolution had made the most culturally prestigious framework available for thinking about biological variation. The giants were, in the newspaper culture of the period, objects of public interest before they became objects of commercial transaction, and the public interest was maintained by the newspapers across the whole of the exhibition career. From the initial announcement of the arrival in the city, through the various promotional events and the publication of the pamphlets and the broadsides, and ending, inevitably, with the death notice and the brief obituary that was the last form of press attention most of them received. The obituaries are among the most revealing documents in the archive of this history because they are the point at which the promotional logic of the exhibition is at its most vulnerable to the competing claims of ordinary human reality. An obituary of a 22-year-old who has died of complications of a medical condition he did not choose and could not treat cannot entirely sustain the mythological framing that had served the exhibition. It has to acknowledge the person, has to use the biographical language of loss and grief and ending, that is the register of the obituary form, and in that register, the extraordinariness of the height becomes less important than the ordinariness of the dying, which is the same dying that awaits everyone, occurring here simply sooner and less avoidably than most. The obituaries of the exhibition giants, when they are examined closely, show this tension between the promotional mythology and the human reality with particular clarity, oscillating between the language of wonder, in which the death of the remarkable body is presented as the end of a natural spectacle, and the language of ordinary human grief, in which the death of a young person far from home in a city that had used him commercially is presented as the sad and premature conclusion of a life that might otherwise have contained considerably more. The broadsides and pamphlets that were the primary promotional medium for giant exhibition before the newspaper advertisement became the dominant form were produced by a printing industry that was itself undergoing rapid development across the 18th and 19th centuries, and the technical history of the broadside as a medium intersects in interesting ways with the cultural history of the giant exhibition. The broadside was typically a single sheet printed on one or both sides with a combination of text and, where the budget and the technical facilities permitted, a woodcut or engraved illustration. The illustration that accompanied a giant exhibition broadside was typically a full-figure portrait of the subject, drawn at a scale that emphasized the contrast between his height and the height of ordinarily sized figures placed alongside him for comparison, because the visual communication of extraordinary height requires a reference point, and the human figure, at ordinary scale, is the most immediately legible reference point available. The result is a visual formula that repeats across hundreds of surviving broadsides from this period. The tall figure, dominating the center of the image, one or two ordinarily sized figures at his side whose heads reach approximately to his waist or his elbow, and a brief legend below naming the subject and giving his claimed height. These images were not accurate portraits in any meaningful sense. The artists who produced the woodcuts and engravings were working from brief encounters or from verbal descriptions and were primarily concerned with communicating the essential visual fact of extraordinary height, rather than with capturing any individual likeness. The result is that most of the surviving illustrations of exhibition giants are technically interchangeable. A tall figure with the characteristic physical features of pituitary gigantism, the enlarged brow and jaw, the large hands, the somewhat stiff posture of a body carrying more weight than its joints can comfortably support, standing in the conventional exhibition pose. The individuality of the person behind the image is entirely absent, which is consistent with the broader dynamics of the exhibition tradition, but which makes the broadsides, as historical sources, more useful as evidence of how the giants were presented than as evidence of what they actually looked like or who they actually were. The relationship between the giant exhibition tradition and the broader culture of natural philosophy and, later, natural history in Britain produced some of the more intellectually interesting interactions in the history of the phenomenon. The 18th century natural philosophical tradition, which operated primarily through learned societies, like the Royal Society, and through the circulation of manuscripts and printed correspondence among gentlemen who pursued natural knowledge as a gentlemanly occupation, took a genuine interest in the exhibition giants as examples of the natural world's capacity for variation, and the measurements and observations produced by natural philosophers who attended the exhibitions were published in the Philosophical Transactions and other learned journals of the period. This scientific interest was not purely extractive, though it was often primarily extractive. It also included genuine intellectual curiosity about the mechanisms of human growth, about the limits of human variation, and about what the existence of very tall people implied for theories of human nature and human origins that were being actively debated in the period. The specific question that the existence of very tall people raised for 18th century natural philosophy was the question of whether human variation was unlimited or bounded, which connected directly to the theological question of whether human beings had been created in a specific form or whether they were capable of unlimited modification. The giants were, for natural philosophers, who were still working within broadly creationist frameworks, evidence that the human form could deviate significantly from its typical expression while remaining recognizably human, which was theologically complicated. For natural philosophers who were moving toward more naturalistic frameworks, the giants were evidence that human variation was governed by the same laws as variation in other natural phenomena, which was intellectually significant but also raised uncomfortable questions about what those laws were and what they implied for human dignity and human uniqueness. The natural history tradition that succeeded natural philosophy and that reached its fullest Victorian expression in the work of Charles Darwin and his contemporaries had a different relationship to the giant exhibition tradition. Darwinian natural history understood human variation as the product of the same processes that produced variation in all living things. Processes of inheritance and modification that operated without teleological direction or divine intention. Within this framework, the very tall person was not a supernatural remnant or a divine experiment, but a variation produced by the same natural lottery that produced all biological variation, a lottery that sometimes threw up results that were interesting from a scientific perspective, but that had no deeper significance than any other outcome of the same processes. This was in one sense, a more humanizing framework than the mythological one, because it naturalized the giant's body rather than supernaturalizing it, placed it within the same continuum as all other human bodies rather than outside and above that continuum. But it was also, in practice, a framework that made the giant's body more thoroughly available for scientific appropriation than the mythological framework had, because the mythological framework at least implied a kind of reverence, however commercially exploited, that the natural history framework did not. The provincial exhibition circuit, which expanded significantly with the growth of the railway network, from the 1840s onward, produced its own specific culture and its own specific cast of characters that differ from the London exhibition tradition in ways that have not always been given adequate attention. London was the primary market, the place where the largest audiences and the highest fees could be found. But the provincial cities were not simply a secondary market. They were, in many cases, the places where the relationship between the exhibition subject and the local community was more sustained and more human than the transactional relationship available in London. A giant who spent several weeks or months in Manchester or Birmingham or Edinburgh exhibiting to local audiences who came back for second and third visits and who wrote about the exhibitions in local newspapers and who remembered them for years afterward, was participating in a social relationship that had a different texture from the rapid succession of strangers that characterized the London exhibition. The provincial audiences knew their exhibition giants in a way that London audiences typically did not, and the accounts of giant exhibitions in the provincial press have a warmth and a personal quality that the London coverage rarely matches. The Scottish exhibition tradition, which was part of the broader British picture, but which had its own specific characteristics rooted in the Scottish cultural history, produced several notable exhibition figures in the 19th century and a distinctive approach to the presentation of extraordinary height that reflected the specific mythological resources available in Scottish culture. Scotland had its own giant traditions, rooted in the mythology of the Highlands and the Gaelic-speaking communities of the West, traditions that were somewhat different from the English and Irish traditions in their specific contents, but that shared the basic template of giants as powerful, ancient, and connected to a pre-human or proto-human past. The Romantic movement's enthusiasm for Highland culture, which had been generated in large part by James Macpherson's Ossian poems and Walter Scott's fiction, had by the mid-19th century made the Highland giant a specific cultural type, the embodiment of a martial and masculine tradition that the Victorian imagination associated with authentic ancestral strength in contrast to the feminized and commercialized present. Exhibition promoters in Scotland and promoters exhibiting Scottish giants in England were able to draw on this Highland mythological resource in ways that their counterparts promoting Irish giants could not, because the Highland giant carried different cultural associations from the Irish giant, associations that were specifically martial and aristocratic rather than folkloric and supernatural. The Scottish exhibition giant could be presented as the physical embodiment of the heroic Highland warrior tradition, which was a figure that the Victorian Romantic imagination found more congenial than the mythological giant descended from Gog-Magog, and which allowed the exhibition to be framed in terms of cultural nostalgia as well as natural wonder. This cultural nostalgia was entirely invented, in the sense that there was no actual connection between the extraordinarily tall Scottish men who were exhibited and the martial culture of the Highland clans that had been suppressed and dispersed in the aftermath of Culloden. But the invention was culturally productive and commercially effective, and it illustrates the flexibility of the mythological framework, its ability to absorb new cultural materials and to adapt to new commercial contexts, while maintaining the essential structure of the claim that the exhibition subject was not merely unusually tall, but was somehow representative of something ancient and important. The music hall giants of the Victorian period, to whom we have already given some attention, deserve to be examined more specifically in terms of the individual acts they developed and the way those acts negotiated the specific demands of the variety entertainment format. The variety format required acts of bounded duration, typically between 5 and 15 minutes, that could hold a large and often partly distracted audience in a space that also included drinking and conversation. The static exhibition format of the hired room, in which the audience circulated around the subject and the encounter was of indefinite duration, was not directly transferable to this context without modification. The modifications that the music hall giants developed to fit their acts into the variety format tell us a great deal about both the constraints of the format and the creative agency of the people working within it. Some of the modifications were purely theatrical. The development of a patter, a standard set of remarks and responses to audience questions that could be delivered reliably in the time available, and that were entertaining enough to hold attention without requiring any unusual performance skill. Some were more physically theatrical, using the contrast in scale between the giant and an ordinarily sized partner or foil to generate visual comedy that required no verbal elaboration. The pairing of a very tall person with a very short person, a format with a long history in the entertainment tradition, was particularly effective in the music hall context, because the visual contrast was immediately legible across a large and dimly lit room, and the comic potential of the two extremes of the human scale range interacting with each other could be developed in a variety of ways that did not require the audience to be particularly attentive or knowledgeable. The more intellectually ambitious music hall giants incorporated the emerging discourse of popular science into their acts, presenting their own bodies as subjects for public scientific inquiry in a way that positioned the exhibition as educational as well as entertaining. This approach was both a response to the growing cultural prestige of science in the Victorian period and a commercial strategy for distinguishing the act from the cruder forms of human exhibition, differentiating the serious inquiry into natural variation from the mere gawking at the remarkable. Whether it also represented a form of dignity, a way of making the inevitable exhibition more tolerable by giving it an intellectual frame, is harder to determine from the historical record, but it is not implausible that some of the exhibition subjects found the scientific framing more bearable than the purely spectacular one, because the scientific framing at least treated them as interesting rather than merely as visually striking. The relationship between the British giant exhibition tradition and the various reform movements that operated in Victorian Britain is an aspect of the history that has been somewhat neglected in both the cultural history of the period and the specialist literature on the exhibition tradition. The Victorian reform movements were diverse and not always internally consistent, ranging from the temperance movement to the movement for prison reform, to the movement for the improved treatment of the mentally ill, to the emerging animal welfare movement, and they approached the question of human exhibition from various directions and with various degrees of engagement. The temperance movement was interested in the exhibition tradition, primarily because many of the venues where exhibitions took place were associated with drinking, and the attempt to disentangle the entertainment from the drink was one of the motives for the reform of popular entertainment venues that produced the modern music hall. The animal welfare movement produced arguments about the exhibition of performing animals that occasionally extended, by a logic that not everyone followed consistently, to the exhibition of human beings, and the comparisons between the treatment of animals in menageries and the treatment of human beings in freak shows appeared in reform literature, with enough frequency to suggest that at least some reformers saw the connection. The most significant reform engagement with the giant exhibition tradition came, however, not from any of the established reform movements, but from the emerging medical profession, which had ambiguous and internally contradictory relationships with the exhibition of extraordinary bodies. On one hand, the medical profession was, as we have already discussed, one of the primary beneficiaries of the exhibition tradition, using the living exhibition subjects as data sources and the dead ones as specimens. On the other hand, the growing professionalization of medicine in the Victorian period, the consolidation of the medical profession as a body with specific ethical obligations to patients rather than merely scientific interests in interesting bodies, produced increasing discomfort within the profession about the relationship between the scientific interest and the commercial exhibition. By the later Victorian period, medical journals were occasionally publishing commentary that distinguished between legitimate scientific study of unusual bodies and the commercial exhibition of those bodies for entertainment, arguing that the two could and should be separated, and that the medical profession's participation in or endorsement of the entertainment dimension was incompatible with its professional obligations. This internal medical critique was limited in its effects in the Victorian period, partly because the financial and institutional interests that tied the medical profession to the exhibition tradition were strong, and partly because the ethical framework for thinking about patient autonomy and informed consent that would eventually give the critique its full force had not yet been developed. But the critique was the beginning of a tradition of medical ethical reflection that would eventually produce the formal structures of research ethics and informed consent that govern the relationship between medicine and the extraordinary body today. Structures that would have protected Charles Byrne from John Hunter if they had existed in 1783, and that protect his living descendants from comparable exploitation today. The question of what the exhibition giants understood about their own situation, about the framework of cultural and commercial and scientific forces that surrounded them, is one to which the historical record offers only fragmentary answers. We can say with some confidence that they were not naive about the commercial dimension, because the evidence of their financial arrangements and the negotiations, some of them conducted over contracts and fees, suggests a practical understanding of the business they were in. We can say with some confidence that they were aware of the medical profession's interest in their bodies, because the preparations made by Byrne and Cotter O'Brien for their burials presuppose an understanding of what that interest was likely to produce, if not actively resisted. But whether they understood the mythological framework that shaped the audience's response to them, whether they were able to see clearly the contrast between the mythological being the audience came to encounter and the suffering young man who was actually standing in the room, is harder to determine. Some of the accounts that survive suggest a kind of ironic self-awareness in some of the exhibition giants, a capacity to observe their own situation with some detachment and to find, if not amusement exactly, at least a kind of intellectual engagement with the strangeness of their position. The humour that several accounts attribute to Charles Byrne, the willingness to make jokes about his height and his situation that visitors found charming and unexpected, is consistent with this kind of self-awareness, the ability to see oneself as others see you and to deploy that perspective in a social context. But it is also consistent with something more defensive, the social performance of equanimity by a person who understood that any other emotional register would make an already difficult situation more difficult, and that the audience wanted a certain kind of interaction and would be less comfortable and perhaps less generous if the interaction deviated too far from the expected script. The exploitation of the exhibition giants was not primarily the result of individual bad actors, though individual bad actors certainly participated in it. It was the result of a structural arrangement in which the economic vulnerability of very tall people in a world not built for very tall people, the commercial incentives of the entertainment industry, the scientific appetite of the medical and anatomical establishment, and the cultural framework that turned extraordinary bodies into public property all operated simultaneously in the same direction. The individuals within this structure, the promoters and physicians and newspaper writers and paying customers, were mostly doing what the structure rewarded and permitted, which is to say, they were mostly behaving as the incentives of their situation directed them to behave. This does not absolve any of them, least of all John Hunter, whose acquisition of Charles Byrne's skeleton involved actions that were clearly understood as wrong even by the ethical standards of his own time, given that he felt the need to pursue the acquisition through bribery and deception rather than openly. But it does suggest that the history cannot be adequately understood as a history of individual villainy, and that the structural dimension, The arrangement of institutions and incentives and cultural frameworks that made the exploitation so consistent and so thoroughgoing is what most needs to be understood and named. The persistence of that structural dimension in modified form into the present is part of what makes this history more than a matter of historical interest. The Royal College of Surgeons retaining the skeleton of Charles Byrne against his clearly expressed wishes is a structural problem in the same sense that the original acquisition was a structural problem. It is an institution with considerable power and resources prioritizing its own interests over the clearly expressed wishes of a person who lacked the power to enforce those wishes, and using the language of scientific benefit to justify the prioritization. The specific people making the specific decisions at the Royal College of Surgeons today are not, presumably, motivated by the same combination of scientific obsession and ethical insensitivity that motivated John Hunter. But the institutional logic they are operating within is recognizably descended from the institutional logic that Hunter was operating within. And the arguments for retaining the skeleton now are structurally similar to the arguments that have always been used to justify the acquisition and retention of bodies obtained without consent. That the scientific benefit is real, that it extends to people who are still alive, that the passage of time changes the moral equation, and that the disruption of established institutional arrangements is costly and complex. These arguments are not without substance. They are also, as I have already noted, insufficient. The insufficiency is not a function of the specific details of the Byrne case, but of the general principle that scientific benefit, however real, does not override the right of a person to determine what happens to their own body. That principle is now so well established in the formal ethics of medical research and the law of many jurisdictions that it is difficult to articulate the opposing argument without acknowledging that it represents a departure from the principle rather than an application of it. The departure may be justified in some cases, may represent a genuine ethical complexity that resists simple resolution, but it should, at minimum, be acknowledged as a departure, as a decision to prioritize scientific benefit over bodily autonomy and individual consent, rather than being presented as the only reasonable conclusion. The history of the exhibition giants ends, as histories of this kind often do, in a place that is neither resolution nor closure, but simply continuation. The continuation of questions that were not resolved when they were first raised, and that remain unresolved, because the institutions and the interests and the power dynamics that prevented their resolution are still present, modified and evolved, but structurally similar to what they were when the first men from County Tyrone came to London to stand in hired rooms and be looked at. The questions are still there, the bones are still there, the names are still there, the ones that survived the record, and the absence is still there where the names were not recorded. And the living descendants of the communities that produced the giants are still there, carrying in their genetic inheritance the same variant of the AIP gene that made Charles Byrne 8 feet tall and killed him at 22, and being screened and treated and living their ordinary-sized lives in a world that still does not know quite what to do with the history that produced them, except to look at it, which is perhaps, after everything, the least that can be done. There is something that needs to be said about the children of this history that is separate from the medical genetics, separate from the institutional ethics, and closer to the emotional core of what the history is actually about. Every man who stood in one of those hired rooms in London or the provincial cities was a child of someone, was someone's son, was from a family that had watched him grow and had understood, long before he came to London, that his body was going to make his life difficult and short in ways that ordinary life was not. The mothers and fathers and siblings of the exhibition giants are almost entirely absent from the historical record, because the record was interested in the body in the exhibition room and not in the family in the Irish countryside who waited for news and who received, eventually, the news that the waiting had been about. What those families understood about what was happening to their tall children, whether they sent them to London with hope or with resignation, whether they expected to see them again, whether they mourned when they did not, is almost entirely beyond the reach of historical reconstruction. But the families were real as the measurements and the dates, and their reality is part of the full accounting of what this history was and what it cost, and what remains owed to the people who paid the cost. The physical geography of the exhibition world in Victorian Britain is something that can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence from the surviving records, and the reconstruction reveals a landscape of rooms and stages and fairground spaces that tells its own story about the conditions under which the exhibitions were conducted. The hired rooms that served as exhibition venues in the 18th and early 19th centuries were typically located in the entertainment districts of major cities, in the streets around the Haymarket and Charing Cross in London, in similar areas in Edinburgh and Bath and Bristol. They were rooms in buildings that had other uses, buildings owned by landlords who rented them out for various purposes and who charged a premium for the use of rooms with high ceilings, because the standard ceiling height of most 18th century London rooms was too low for an 8-foot man to stand upright in, and a landlord who owned a building with high-ceilinged rooms near a major thoroughfare was sitting on a commercial asset that the exhibition market valued specifically. The arrangement of the room for exhibition followed a fairly standard format. The exhibition subject typically stood or sat at one end of the room, often on a raised platform that increased the visual impact of his height by placing him higher than the surrounding audience, though this was a format more suitable for a 7-footer than an 8-footer, whose head might then come uncomfortably close to the ceiling. The audience circulated in the remaining space, approaching as close as they wished and maintaining as much distance as they wished, with the management of crowd flow typically handled by the exhibition subject's assistant or by the landlord's staff. The room was usually decorated with the promotional materials of the exhibition, the broadsides and portraits and measurement certificates that gave the encounter a context and a documentation that the purely visual experience of proximity to an extraordinary body might otherwise lack. The smell of these rooms, in the absence of any historical record specifically about it, can be reconstructed by inference. 18th and 19th century rooms heated by coal fires and occupied by large numbers of people in wet wool coats smelled in specific ways that are well enough documented in other contexts to permit reconstruction here. The combination of coal smoke, tallow candles, wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the particular biological heat that crowds generate would have been pervasive and would have constituted, for the exhibition subjects who spent hours in these rooms daily, an environmental reality that the broadsides and the newspaper accounts entirely omit. The sensory environment of the exhibition room, which included not only the smell, but the noise of the crowd, the cold air when the door opened to admit new visitors, the physical pressure of people attempting to get close enough to verify the measurements they had read about in the handbill, was the actual context in which the exhibition experience occurred for the man standing at the center of it. And it was a context considerably less dignified and considerably less comfortable than the promotional language suggested. The transition from the hired room to the permanent exhibition hall, which occurred through the middle decades of the 19th century as the entertainment industry developed more substantial physical infrastructure, represented a significant improvement in exhibition conditions from a purely physical perspective. The purpose-built exhibition halls of the Victorian period, of which several existed in London and in the major provincial cities, had higher ceilings, better heating, better ventilation, and better management of audience flow than the hired rooms of the earlier period. They also had a different social atmosphere. The permanent exhibition hall was a more self-consciously respectable venue than the hired room, more closely associated with educational and improving entertainment, and less closely associated with the pub-adjacent world of the old fair tradition. This shift in social atmosphere had implications for the kinds of audiences the exhibitions attracted, and for the kinds of promotional framing that were commercially effective, with the improving rhetoric of popular science becoming more prominent and the mythological rhetoric of ancient lineage becoming somewhat more circumspect. The waxwork tradition, which produced permanent representations of celebrated giants that outlasted the exhibitions themselves and that served as a kind of historical record of the exhibition tradition, was a product of the same improving entertainment culture. The major wax museums of Victorian Britain, including Madame Tussauds in Baker Street and the various provincial wax exhibitions that copied its format, exhibited figures of famous exhibition giants as part of their catalogues of notable persons, typically in the company of royalty, famous criminals, military heroes, and figures from recent history. The giant waxwork served a different function from the living giant exhibition. It was historical and commemorative rather than immediate and spectacular, and it preserved the physical image of the exhibition subject in a form that could be exhibited indefinitely without the cooperation or the continued health of the actual person. For the Wax Museum, the giant was a historical figure, a permanent part of the catalogue of notable persons. For the giant, the waxwork was a peculiar form of afterlife, the body reproduced in a medium that would outlast the original by decades and that would continue to be exhibited and to be looked at long after the original was dead, and, in some cases, mounted in a glass case in an anatomical museum. The question of what ordinary British people in the Victorian period actually believed about the origins of the giants they paid to see is one of the more genuinely interesting questions in this history, and it is one to which the evidence gives a genuinely ambiguous answer. The cultural framework that the promotional materials offered was mythological and ancient, and the audiences who attended were shaped by that framework. But they were not simple, and they were not credulous in the way that the promotional mythology might imply. The Victorian period was one of rapidly increasing popular science literacy, driven by the cheap periodical press and by the institutional culture of mechanics institutes and working men's libraries and the various educational initiatives of the improving tradition. The audiences who attended giant exhibitions were not all naive believers in the mythology the handbills promoted. Many of them were capable of holding the mythological frame and the natural history frame simultaneously, of enjoying the wonder that the mythology generated while also understanding, at some level, that the actual explanation for the remarkable body in front of them was biological rather than supernatural. This capacity for holding multiple frameworks simultaneously is not unusual and is probably better described as the normal condition of most people's engagement with extraordinary phenomena than as a special or sophisticated response. Human beings are generally capable of responding to something emotionally within one framework while intellectually placing it within another, and the pleasure of the giant exhibition was partly a pleasure of allowing the mythological response to operate without the intellectual framework intervening to suppress it. The audience at the giant exhibition was, in this sense, doing something similar to what the audience at a horror film does, allowing themselves to respond within a framework that their more reflective intellectual capacities might not endorse, because the response itself is interesting and the endorsement of the framework is not actually required for the response to occur. The post-exhibition discourse, the letters and diaries and newspaper reports in which audience members recorded their responses to the exhibitions they had attended, is the richest source for understanding what the experience actually meant to the people who paid for it. These accounts are variable in quality and in their degree of reflective self-awareness, ranging from brief factual notes that simply record the height and the date, to extended reflections that attempt to characterize the emotional experience of standing in close proximity to a body so much larger than one's own. The most interesting of these accounts are those that register the dissonance between the mythological expectation and the human reality, that notice the gap between the colossus, advertised in the handbill, and the young man in the room, that acknowledge, however briefly, the person standing at the center of the spectacle and ask questions about that person's inner life that the exhibition format was specifically designed not to answer. These accounts are a minority, but their existence suggests that the capacity for the humanizing response, the response that saw through the exhibition frame to the person behind it, was present in Victorian audiences, even if it was not the dominant response, and even if the commercial and cultural logic of the exhibition worked actively to suppress it. The relationship between the giant exhibition tradition and the Victorian culture of the body, more broadly, is an aspect of the history that connects it to questions that were central to Victorian intellectual and cultural life. Questions about what the human body was, what it signified, how it should be managed and displayed and interpreted. The Victorian body was a site of enormous cultural anxiety, caught between the religious tradition that saw it as the vessel of the immortal soul and the scientific tradition that was increasingly explaining it in purely biological terms, between the moral tradition that saw its functions and desires as requiring management and discipline, and the romantic tradition that saw its authentic impulses as sources of truth. The extraordinary body, the body that fell outside the normal range in ways that were undeniably physical and biological, and that resisted the standard forms of moral management, was a particular focus of this anxiety, and the exhibition of extraordinary bodies served, among its other functions, as a cultural mechanism for processing that anxiety by putting the extraordinary body in a controlled context where it could be examined and assessed and ultimately contained within a framework of meaning. The giants in the glass cases and the hired rooms were, in this sense, objects of a specifically Victorian form of cultural work, the work of making sense of the body in a period when the body had become newly and deeply problematic. They were not only entertainment and not only science and not only mythology. They were all of these things, and they were also, at the level of cultural function, a way of managing the anxiety that the Victorian period felt about what the body was and what it meant and what it could do. The very tallness of the exhibition giant, his undeniable physicality, his refusal to be contained within the standard dimensions of Victorian physical culture, was simultaneously disturbing and reassuring. Disturbing because it demonstrated that the body could deviate dramatically from its expected form, and reassuring because the giant in the exhibition room was safely contained, was exhibited rather than at large, was looking at the audience across a supervised distance that maintained the boundary between the remarkable and the ordinary. This containment function of the exhibition is not unique to the Victorian period and is not specific to the giant exhibition. It is a general function of the spectacle in many historical contexts. The displayed extraordinary is contained extraordinary, which is to say, it is extraordinary that has been given a frame and a context that prevents it from being simply threatening. The audience at a giant exhibition was doing something that served this containment function every time they paid and walked in and looked and walked out again, reassured that the giant was still in the room and they were still in the world outside it. The threat that the extraordinary body represented, whatever that threat was at any particular moment in the cultural history, was managed by the act of exhibition itself, by the commercial and institutional framework that placed the extraordinary body in a room that ordinary bodies could choose to enter or not enter on terms they controlled. Understanding the giant exhibition tradition as a form of cultural work, as a mechanism for processing and managing cultural anxieties about the body and about human variation, does not resolve the ethical questions raised by the exploitation of the people who were exhibited. It contextualizes those questions places them within a broader explanation of why the exploitation was so consistent and so thoroughgoing and so resistant to ethical challenge. But it does not excuse it. The cultural function served by the exhibition did not require the exploitation of the exhibition subjects. It required their presence, but the terms on which they were present, the financial arrangements, the power relationships, the treatment of their bodies in life and after death were not necessitated by the cultural function. They were the result of the specific social and economic arrangements that governed the exploitation of working-class bodies in Victorian Britain. More generally, arrangements that had nothing to do with mythology or cultural anxiety, and everything to do with who had power and who did not, who could set terms and who had to accept them, and who would be protected by the law and who would not. That is the history in its full dimensions: mythological and medical and commercial and ethical and genetic and institutional. All of these things at once, all of them operating simultaneously on the bodies of young men who came from County Tyrone and County Cork and the East Riding of Yorkshire, and who stood in rooms and were looked at and died young, and are remembered or not remembered, depending on whether the record happened to preserve their names. The record preserved some names and not others. The ones it did not preserve are not less real for the absence. They are simply less recoverable, which is a different kind of loss than being unreal, and a loss that is worth acknowledging before the account concludes. What is owed to the ones whose names survived and the ones whose names did not is the same thing. The acknowledgement that they were people first, before they were exhibitions or specimens or measurements or cases in medical literature. They were people first and everything else after, and the history that treated them as everything else first is a history that got it wrong, and getting it wrong has consequences that have not yet finished playing out, which is why this history is not, despite its age, a matter of purely historical interest. The skeleton is still in the glass case. The names are still in the record or still absent from it. The debt is still outstanding, and the only direction available is forward, with more honesty than the institutions that created this situation have so far been willing to muster, and with more respect for the persons behind the measurements than the tradition that recorded them thought to offer at the time. That is the last thing this history asks for. It is not a large ask, by any reasonable measure. It is simply the minimum that the people at its centre were always owed and never received. There is a particular kind of history that a society does not teach, because teaching it would require the society to look at itself in ways it finds uncomfortable, and the history of how Britain treated the extraordinarily tall people who lived in it across the 18th and 19th centuries is that kind of history. It is not a history of external conquest or distant exploitation. It is a history of what happened inside the country, inside the cities, inside the institutions, inside the commercial and scientific and cultural arrangements that shaped daily life for everyone who lived in that period. The giants did not come from somewhere else and get mistreated by British institutions in the way that the subjects of colonial exploitation came from somewhere else. They came, in most cases, from Ireland and from the northern counties of England, which were not foreign territories, but were part of the same social and political entity, and they were mistreated within that entity by the specific mechanisms that the entity had developed for extracting value from bodies that fell outside its standard categories. The mistreatment was not violent in the direct physical sense, with the important exception of John Hunter's acquisition of Charles Byrne's body, which involved deception and bribery and the physical diversion of a coffin that was meant to go to the sea. In most other cases, the mistreatment was structural and transactional. The exploitation of economic vulnerability, the unequal contract, the scientific appropriation of the body without consent, the institutional retention of remains against clearly expressed wishes. These are the mechanisms of civilized exploitation, which is to say, the mechanisms of exploitation that does not require the use of direct force, because the power differential is large enough that force is unnecessary. They are the mechanisms that produce the most durable harm, precisely because they are the most deniable, the most easily framed as the natural outcome of voluntary commercial transactions and legitimate scientific interest, rather than as the exploitation of vulnerable people by institutions with more power than accountability. The recognition of this kind of exploitation is harder than the recognition of its more dramatic counterpart, and it produces a more complex and less satisfying moral response, because it requires the examination not of individual villains, but of structural arrangements, and structural arrangements do not make satisfying villains. The history of the British giant exhibition tradition does have one individual who qualifies as a villain by almost any standard, in John Hunter and his £500 and his lying undertakers and his skeleton in the glass case. But Hunter is not the whole story, and focusing on Hunter as the representative villain risks producing the comfortable conclusion that the problem was one bad man rather than one thoroughly bad arrangement, and the arrangement, as I have argued throughout this account, was the problem. The arrangement is also not entirely in the past. The institutions that maintain the remains of the exhibition giants are the same institutions, in some cases literally, and in others by direct institutional inheritance, that acquired those remains in the first place. The logic of scientific benefit that those institutions use to justify the retention is a descendant of the logic of scientific interest that drove the original acquisition. The power differential between the institutions and the individuals whose wishes they are declining to honor is not identical to the power differential between the 18th century medical establishment and the Irish giant in the hired room, but it is structurally similar, and the similarity is not coincidental. It is the persistence of the institutional logic across 2 centuries of change in almost every other relevant domain of British social and cultural life. What would it look like to fully honor the history, to treat the debt as real, and to begin discharging it? In the specific case of Charles Byrne, it would look like returning the skeleton to Ireland for burial in accordance with his wishes, which were expressed clearly and in writing, and which have been known and acknowledged for over 200 years. In the broader case of the exhibition tradition, it would look like institutional acknowledgement of the structural exploitation, not as a historical footnote, but as a genuine reckoning with what the institutions did and with the continuing consequences of what they did. It would look like research ethics frameworks that treat the descendants of the exhibition subjects as stakeholders in the research that uses the remains of their ancestors, rather than as incidental beneficiaries of research conducted entirely at the discretion of the holding institutions. And it would look like a public history of the exhibition tradition that begins with the names and ends with the names and keeps the persons at the center throughout, rather than using the persons as supporting characters in the story of the science, or the mythology, or the commerce that surrounded them. This is the history of those names. It is incomplete, because the record is incomplete, and the accounting is incomplete, and the reckoning is incomplete. But it is as complete as the evidence and the honesty available to this account permit, and it is offered in the spirit in which the best history is always offered, as a corrective to the simpler stories, as a claim that the full truth is more important than the comfortable version, and as a gesture of respect toward the people at its center, who were owed that respect and who received, instead, a lifetime of being looked at and a death of being retained against their will. The looking is over, the retention is ongoing, and the names, at least, are here. One final thing deserves to be said about the physical landscape of modern Britain and its relationship to this history, because the landscape has not stopped speaking since this account began, and it would be wrong to end without acknowledging what it continues to say. The chalk figures are still on their hillsides. The long man of Wilmington still looks out across East Sussex with the same impassive expression he has worn for centuries, and the Cerne Abbas giant still stands on his Dorset hill, and the Uffington White Horse still occupies its chalk-cut space on the Oxfordshire Downs. The hill figures were there before the first exhibition giant came to London, and they will be there after the last argument about Charles Byrne's skeleton has been concluded. They belong to a story much longer than the one this account has told, a story in which the particular events of the 18th and 19th centuries are an episode, an important episode, but an episode nonetheless, in the longer British negotiation with the idea of the enormous, the ancient, the body that exceeds the ordinary scale of things. What the landscape cannot tell you is what it cost, and that is the part that requires the history, and that is the part that requires the names. The landscape says something enormous was here. The history says yes, and here is who paid for it, and here is what they were called, and here is what they wanted, and here is what they got instead, and here is what we still owe them. That is the whole of it. That is the last thing the history of the British exhibition giant has to offer, and it is, when you stand with it, long enough to feel its full weight, more than enough. Thank you for staying with this story to its end. If it reached you, please pass it along. Subscribe, share, and look in the description for the further reading that goes deeper than any video can. The next history is waiting, and it is as strange and as human and as unresolved as this one. It always is. There is still the question of the landscape's longer memory and what it asks of the people who move through it now. Anyone who walks the chalk paths of the North Downs or crosses the flint-studded fields of East Anglia or stands on the windy ridge of the Yorkshire Wolds is moving through a terrain that was shaped by a sequence of human occupations stretching back 12,000 years, each of which left its own marks in the soil. And the hill figures and the earthworks and the stone circles are the most visible of those marks, the ones that were large enough and durable enough to survive the erasures that time and cultivation and construction have applied to everything else. The people who made those marks were not giants. They were ordinary-sized people who worked at a scale that could look, from the outside, like the work of something larger. The mythology that grew up around the marks was the mythology of a culture that found it easier to imagine giants than to imagine the organized collective effort of ordinary people across multiple generations. And the exhibition giants who stood in hired rooms in London and Edinburgh and Manchester were, in the last analysis, the most human evidence available that the mythology was pointing at something real, not in the supernatural sense, but in the biological sense. That the human body's range of variation was wider than the ordinary range suggested, and that the extremes of that range had always existed among the population, and that the culture's relationship to those extremes had always been complicated by the gap between what the mythology said they meant and what the biology said they were. Closing that gap, the gap between what extraordinary bodies were said to mean and what they actually were, is the work of the history. It is never entirely finished. It is the work that the best history always does. The work of replacing the comfortable story with the truer one, and of insisting that the truer one, however uncomfortable, is the one that serves the people at its centre and the people who come after them. The giants of Victorian Britain deserved the truer story. They still do.